Okay, so you're going to photograph some wildlife. So, what are the things that you really need to think about? Now, I've spoken about a lot of this stuff before in other podcasts, not necessarily all together. And what often happens between recording podcasts is I get asked a question, and it's just an angle or an idea that I hadn't spoken about before when I've been recording these kinds of podcasts. And also, they seem to be fairly popular. So here we are. I'm going to start with some obvious stuff, I guess, or to me it's obvious, but it might not be to somebody else. And that is to think about the kind of animals that you're going to be photographing. So if you are going away somewhere, and I guess I'm pitching this more if you're going on a holiday or a vacation somewhere, or maybe volunteering in a place you haven't been to before, it's somewhere a bit more exotic, a bit more unusual for you, and wildlife is an aspect of it. And what are the kind of animals you're likely to see? So even if you're going to somewhere, let's say Africa or India, and you're going to hopefully be photographing elephants or tigers or whatever it might be, definitely those are animals you need to think about. That would be the primary animals you would expect to see. But what else is there? What other animals are you likely to see? What other mammals? Are there going to be reptiles? You're going to be pretty unlucky if there aren't any birds around somewhere, because usually there are birds. And what about insects as well? So there's quite a few different animals you might end up shooting, even if they aren't your primary reason for being there. So first of all, and I always say this, the best thing to do is to research where you're going and find out the kind of wildlife that you're likely to come across in that area. And I would expand that out beyond mammals, let's say, if you're going to photograph elephants. What else is there? Because the chances are, if you're going somewhere hot, there will be reptiles of some description. You'd be pretty unlucky not to find insects. And as I've said, birds are likely to be a part of it too. So have a look around, do what research you can on what type of animals are about. Now, some of this can be kind of linked into medical preparation. So I'm thinking of things like mosquitoes and stuff like that. But animals feed on, other insects feed on them. So there are some very interesting insects you can find. And even where I live here in France, in the house a few weeks ago, actually, I found what looked to me like a big green kind of grasshopper thing. And so you can tell I don't know that much about insects. But also I get a lot of these tiny little lizards living around the place. So I've got different spots around the property. I've got a little well where they tend to live around that. There's a big shed where I keep a lot of gear. They tend to hang around that area. But what I hadn't realised was that these grasshopper things, they do have a proper name, but they actually feed on these very small lizards. And that's something that I hadn't thought about. And if I had thought about it, it might be something that I might try and photograph at some point. And although it's pretty horrible from one perspective, it is something unusual in the place that I live. So one thing to do is to look at what's going on around where you live. This might be a good source of, first of all, just learning about the wildlife, including anything with legs that's living, or possibly without legs in the case of a snake. But you can learn more about what's going on around you and then think about how you would photograph that. And this is really, really good practice for when you do go away, because you really want that kind of approach, how you approach a subject, how you compose the images. That really wants to be second nature. The more practice you can get, the better you're going to be, because you can look at what you've shot at home, you can decide what's right about it, what's wrong about it, change how you shoot, go back and hopefully shoot the same thing again and start to develop. And as you do that, you get more familiar with your camera. The composition becomes automatic almost. So it means that you're spending less time on the technical side of the photography and more side just really connecting with the animal and thinking about what it is you want to do with that photograph. And that's something I will talk about shortly. So do have a think about the kind of animals and wildlife that you're likely to see, because these animals are likely to be active at different times of the day. So mammals are active pretty much throughout the day, but the best times to shoot them, I think, are in golden hours. So that's that hour after sunrise and that hour before sunset, where you get that golden light. And if you can get animals during that period, you get this really lovely light on them. Of course, some animals might be less active during the day. So certainly if you're somewhere very hot, the chances are that the mammals will be staying in the shade in the hottest part of the day. They might be more active around dusk and around sunrise, or they may even be more active at night. So if that's the case, then you've really got to think about how you handle that photography, because flash photography and wildlife, in my opinion, don't mix. So you need to find a different approach to photographing animals at night, which might be using a camera that's very good at low light situations. And you might not have great quality, but nonetheless, the situation that you're filming might kind of get around the low quality issue and still give you an interesting photograph. So different things to think about depending on your subject. And of course, it also influences the equipment that you're going to need. So let's look at lenses and the camera that you're going to use. So if I'm going to photograph large animals, let's say elephants or lions or tigers or whatever it might be, I'll generally take a telephoto lens with me. And I like to use Canon gear at the moment. So I use one of the Canon 100 to 400 mil zoom lenses. And my reason for doing that is that it's probably the heaviest lens and the longest lens that I can use just holding and photographing handheld. So just holding it in my hands without a tripod. If you want to photograph birds, really you want to be 500 to 600 mil, but that can get very tricky when it comes to just hand holding the lens. And again, my opinion, you really want to have a tripod or something to be resting the camera on when you're using a lens like that. Do you even use a zoom lens? So I tend to use a zoom, but if you've got a primary lens, generally they're far better to use because the quality of the lens will be much better. The aperture of the lens is likely to be bigger. So this is why they look physically bigger. The diameter is larger because they give you a much bigger aperture, and that can give you some absolutely cracking depth of field. That is what's in focus and what isn't. You've got a very bright image, so it means you've got a lot of choice in what sort of shutter speed you use. So those lenses are probably, I would say, they're the best lenses to use in terms of the quality of the photograph you're going to produce. And if you were listening to me speaking to Carolina Nori, who actually runs workshops in Africa and lives in South Africa now, she kind of uses the same approach I do, just use a telephoto zoom, but her favorite lens is actually a primary lens, and that gives her absolutely cracking photographs. So these are things to think about. If you want to photograph insects or even small reptiles, you probably want a macro lens. So again, a macro lens, if you don't know that term, is simply a lens that will allow you to focus very, very close to the end of the lens. If you look at standard lenses, most lenses, you need to be a distance away. It depends on the lens itself, but it might be 1 or 2 meters, might even be longer. But in order to get good insect shots, and I have done this with a telephoto, but it's not ideal, you really want to be able to get your camera very, very close to the subject if they'll allow it, and just shoot at a very, very short distance. That gives you these really good insect photographs if you've seen those on Instagram or in books or wherever you might have found them. So have a think about that. I've got a short zoom lens. It's 28 to 135 mil, and that gives me macro capability as well. So that generally is the other lens I'll take with me if I'm just taking 2 lenses, because that gives me the opportunity to do a wide angle shot as well, which might be something I want to do, because in addition to getting close-up shots of the animals, I like to shoot photographs that I think of them as context shots, but they're basically showing the environment that the animal is in. So a wide angle of some description is a good way of doing that. Although if you've got a smartphone, and if you listened to my last podcast, I was talking about smartphone photography, you might even find that your smartphone is good in that situation. It might actually be better in low light situations than your DSLR or mirrorless, depending on what you're using. So don't forget the kit that is not perhaps primarily photography equipment, but can be used to take photographs. So have a think about what you're photographing, when you're likely to photograph. And again, things like birds, time of day, they tend to be more active in the morning when they're feeding. Reptiles will tend to be more active in the middle of the day in the afternoon when they've had a chance to warm up. So all of these different animals will be active at different times of the day. So do a bit of research on that. And then that will determine to some extent, to the extent where you have choice on what gear you have available, what you're going to take, which camera body, if you're taking a system, DSLR or mirrorless, and which lens or lenses you're going to take with you. Okay, and the other thing, of course, is once you've started thinking about the photographs that you're going to take. Now, I always suggest people plan a bit. You can't be hard and fast about these rules in all situations, because wild animals generally aren't that cooperative when it comes to having the photo taken. Some of them are, but a lot of them aren't. So you really got to be ready to shoot whatever presents itself as an opportunity. But if you've got some ideas about the kind of photograph that you want to get, it means you can try and get yourself in the kind of positions that would allow you to take those shots. So a good one is to try and shoot at the animal's eye level, which in many cases, when I'm photographing animals, I need to get down quite low. So if the way I'm approaching the animal is in a 4x4, those sort of vehicles that you see in safari parks and things, most people will jump up as soon as the roof cover is lifted, or if they don't have a roof, they'll try and stand up and get high. Often I'm going the other way and I'm getting as low as I can and shooting through the windows. If they've got those little, if there is a window at the side and it's one of those little sliding ones, I'll slide it open and stick my camera through that opening and use that, because that gets me lower. And often, although I might not be exactly at the animal's eye line, I'm going to be a lot closer to it than if I was shooting out of the top of the car. And also it means your images will look a bit different. If you think of people who are on a safari holiday, I've seen a lot with these amazing camera setups, and to me, a lot of them are wasted because I can see what they're doing with their photography and they're just shooting Me Too photographs. They're just the same as every other shot you've seen. Whereas if you think about it a bit more, do a bit of planning, you can get down low, plan the kind of shot you want to get with that particular subject, and then go for it. And that will also apply to the lighting and the framing, the composition of the shot. So I'll talk about those too, because I'm like that, trying to be helpful. So yeah, these are things to think about. So as I say, I always research. I'll look at there are some great photographers on Instagram, particularly, and I like to have a look at their work, and it gives me ideas because I just look at some and I think they're absolutely amazing, and I can kind of generally work out how they got that shot. But it's it gives me an idea to try something different with my own photography, and this is how my photography has developed over the years. And I regard photographic style as something that you do develop, but in my experience anyway, it continues to evolve because you just see other things or you try new ideas and that gives you another idea and then you can try that out. So that to me is the beauty of it as a creative activity, to have that constant development going on. So having a thought about how you're going to put the images together is a big thing. Now, of course, you might not be in a four-wheel drive. So I've certainly been in situations where I've tracked animals on foot, or sometimes I've been on a walk through an area. So definitely in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, I did a few walks when I was camping on an island in the Delta there, and we could see zebra and giraffe. Now, they weren't very keen on us getting close to them, so they tend to take off pretty quickly. Other animals were checking us out, and of course, there's nothing between us and those animals. So that's another thing to think about. So always go with a guide who knows what they're doing. I've also tracked both elephant and rhino on foot with, again, in a reserve with the right people. And that means that the gear I'm taking with me wants to be fairly or as light as I can get it, because sometimes you have to walk for quite a distance and you don't want to be making noise. So I normally have my the 100-400 mil on a camera body. I'll be carrying a water bottle as well, because that's to me something that's important to have. And I was even on one walk when I was volunteering, and this woman in the group suddenly started coughing, got just a frog in her throat and couldn't stop coughing. So we used that to shut her up by giving her some water, not by hitting her with it or anything. But so yeah, you don't know what's going to transpire, and you certainly don't want to do anything that will startle the animal that you're tracking if you get close to it, because some animals will run away, others will attack. That's their form of defense. So you really have to think this through, and you need to be comfortable carrying this stuff for what could be a few hours. And again, going back to my experience in Uganda, where we were tracking mountain gorillas. The first time I went, we walked, I'm pretty sure it was 3 hours to get to the gorilla family we were trying to find. They did have trackers out there, and they'd found them, but the gorillas had moved off to the sort of extreme edge of where we could go, and it resulted in a 3-hour hike through, in hilly terrain. Let's say, I wouldn't call it mountainous, but it was definitely hilly. A lot of vegetation, a lot of mud, a lot of water. It's very slippery in places, and you need to be prepared for all of that. So you need to think about the clothing you have as well. Make sure you've got good walking boots, that your arms and legs are protected, not only from the sun, but from scratches and insects and anything else that could scratch you and get into your blood system. So you don't want to get any kind of nasty diseases that way. So do think that sort of stuff through. And I always recommend having a backpack with hip straps on it, because for long distance walking, even if you're carrying your camera, the chances are you'll have something else. Might be a water bottle, which could weigh 1 kilo or more. You might have a rain jacket, a hat if you're not wearing it. The other things that you might just have in your bag, even a snack or two. So that stuff is much better off in a backpack. And if you've got a pack with hip straps, then that means the weight of the pack is on your hips, not on your shoulders. So it just takes the weight off your back. And I find that a lot more comfortable when I'm walking for some distance. Okay, so these are, let's say, things to think about. If you're photographing birds or even some animals, there might be a blind, as in a kind of hide that you get to quite early, and then you wait for the animals to come to you and you take photographs. So again, if that's what you're going to do, just make sure you have the appropriate things you need for that kind of photography. When it comes to composition, I think the first thing is to think about why you're taking the photograph. What's the story? So I've spoken in other podcasts about being a visual storyteller, and that means essentially that it's thinking about what is it about this animal in this situation that I want to convey? What's the story? Am I trying to give the viewer some sort of insight into how it lives, the kind of place it lives? Am I telling a story about conservation? Is this animal under threat? Is the environment it's in being destroyed? Am I essentially just documenting the animal? Do I want to get, say, headshots of an animal that has a unique patterning on its face, so that shot can be in turn used to identify that individual? Or there can be other reasons why you're taking the photograph, but it's important to be clear about why you're taking the photograph. It might be that you want to do something on a conservation theme, and the best way to do that is for the viewer to feel connected to that animal. So this, one way of doing that is to get down to the animal's eye level and get a strong portrait shot, and obviously the connection is through the eyes. So in terms of lighting, I try and make sure that at least one of the animal's eyes is lit. It's not always possible. As I say, wild animals aren't always that cooperative when it comes to taking photographs of them. But if you can get one of the eyes lit, well exposed, so that the whoever's viewing the picture can really see the eye of that animal, then that becomes, for me, the focal point of that shot. Everything else in that composition is to support that point, that connection between the viewer and the animal. I think it was David Attenborough, he basically says, we're not going to worry about conserving things we don't care about. So, if your object is to make the viewer care, then I would suggest, just an idea, that might be one way of going about it. And I'm sure there are many others. So this is the kind of thing to start thinking about when you're telling your story. Now, when you're doing composition as well, think about other things you can use. So where are you going to position the subject in the frame? Are you going to use rule of thirds? And if you're not familiar with that, check it out. I won't go through it in this podcast, but I have in others, and certainly in webinars, because rule of thirds is just a nice fallback way of creating a more interesting composition. Now, you can build on that by using things like depth of field. So how much of the animal's face, let's say, is in focus and what's out of focus, both in the foreground and the background. How are you using foreground and background? Is there a lot of foreground between the viewer and the animal, or is it mostly background? Because if you start working with the space in the image, and I've seen this referred to as negative space. I don't like that term particularly, but you have a lot of space in the image, particularly if you put the subject on one side. That space can be very constructive. It can lead the viewer to start asking certain questions. So how you play with space is very important. If you don't really understand what I'm talking about, then I do recommend you just go out and take some photographs and just put your subject over on one side of the frame, and then shoot the same picture again, but with the subject on the other side of the frame. Play with how much foreground and background you've got. Try shooting in landscape format, tilt the camera around, go portrait format. Look at the different photographs and how do you feel about them emotionally? Does one feel better than another? Because this is a really good test for what works with certain subjects, and it will also help you in determining your own photographic style. Now, another good thing to use is leading lines, and they are simply lines which can be, they can be literal lines. I mean, there might be railway tracks or something like that, or they could be, I guess, implied lines. If you've got a row of trees, for example, they will count as leading lines because they will draw the viewer's eye, or if you set it up correctly anyway, they'll draw the viewer's eye from somewhere in the foreground through to your point of interest, through to your subject. And they don't have to be straight, they can be curvy lines, but think about how you're using them to take the viewer on a journey through the photograph. And as they go on that little journey, is there anything else that you can kind of surprise them with, give them something else to look at? Is there some element in that photograph that adds to the story that you're telling with your photograph? So this might all sound a little bit flaky, maybe, I don't know, but if you're very strong technically on photography, but perhaps not so strong on the creative elements, and you're looking at other people's work and you kind of really like it, but you're not quite sure what they've done, these are the kind of things to look for, because there are probably no more than half a dozen things that people can do in the setting up the composition, and it gives you a huge amount of variation in the feel and the look of that photograph. So I've given you a few, and if you're not really familiar with that, then I really strongly recommend that you go out and just give it a go. The only way you really learn photography is by doing it. So, you could sit and listen to me for hours, but unless you go and do it, you're really not going to learn much. It's just me yakking in the background. So they're quite important aspects of composition. And of course, another element of what's driving the whole setup on your shot is how you're going to use the photographs. So are you going to just use them for social media? Because if you're going to do that, that's fine. It doesn't take away anything from the creativity, but you can get away with quite small files. You can get away with just shooting JPEGs in many situations. I never do, and I don't recommend it. I always recommend going raw, because I always Photoshop things afterwards, or you can use another post-processor, whatever works for you. But that allows me to tweak the image, because I often find that what I've shot on the camera is not the image exactly that I've got in my mind. So that little bit of time you spend after the shoot, and it might be, 5-10% of the actual process of getting that photograph, if you include all the research and learning the technicalities of your camera, getting in the right position, getting your lighting right, your angles, getting in the right position, and all these sorts of things. Probably the post-processing side is the smallest part of that, but it can take a good photograph and make it great. It can really just make it pop and stand out just by tweaking a little bit of contrast, perhaps just changing the saturation. If you're doing a color shot, those little tricks can just bring a photograph alive. So some people are concerned that post-processing an image is somehow lying. It's creating that there's some ethical issues. I haven't actually spoken about this for a while, but you may have heard me speak about this before. And the way I view it is that if your intent with your post-processing is to deceive in some way, then I would say that's not ethical. But if your intent is to create a more interesting artwork, to help make a point, then on the whole, and I'm aware as I say that there is room to bend that and get into the unethical area, but essentially, if your intention is to share the experience of that animal, then I don't see that as being unethical. I don't see post-processing as being unethical. And in fact, if it makes your photograph stand out in a positive way, you'll have a much stronger image. It can help you to get your message across, the reason why you're taking this photograph. You can get your message across in a much more effective way. So if you don't do post-processing at the moment, I really recommend you take a look at it and think about that and just get familiar with some just basic changes you can make to really make a big difference to your work. Okay, and something else I've mentioned about is basic color or black and white. So what's the difference? Well, first of all, I shoot everything in color. So I'm shooting raw files. I shoot in color. I don't do any kind of filtering or anything else on the camera. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is I like to do all of that off the camera anyway, but I can do it with a bit of thinking space. Whereas on the camera, I'm more interested with wildlife, particularly if something's happening fast. I want to be capturing that image, and even the composition to some extent I kind of put to one side. But what I will do on my framing, and this is another thing to think about if you're taking photographs for use as stock photographs, I like to leave extra room around the subject. So rather than come in tight all the time, I like to leave a margin of kind of unused space around the subject, so that when it comes to post-processing, I can always crop that away. But don't forget, if you're shooting stock photographs, the person using the photograph for their work might want space around the subject to put a headline in. So it's a good idea, if you've got a subject where you can take multiple different shots and different framings, just do a nice tight one for you if that's what you like, but then come out and try to go from landscape to portrait format, and give yourself a choice so that there's a choice of things that somebody who might want to use your work can select from, so that they can pick the image that best suits their application. But coming back to color or black and white, the broad difference, in my opinion, between color and black and white is that color is how we're used to seeing things, and black and white isn't. Black and white is much more about shapes, it's about textures, it's about tones. So a black and white photograph has a very different feel to the color image of that same subject. Now, what you do with that obviously is completely up to you. You can change the contrast, you can make it much darker, you can make it much brighter, and each of those will make the final picture feel different. So again, you have to ask yourself, what is it you want? What's the outcome? What's the story? What is it you want to share with the person viewing that image? And equally, when it gets to color, you can play with the saturation, so how bright and how intense the colors are. So I've seen some photographs in wildlife competitions, competitions that have definitely been oversaturated. They're very bright, very vivid colors, and that definitely gives you a very eye-catching image. Now, some people like that. Some people feel it's misrepresenting the subject. So again, it's whatever is right for you is right. One of the things I like to do sometimes is to desaturate the colors so that there are colors still in the final image, but they're very toned down. It almost looks like black and white, but there are hints of color that are you almost pick up subconsciously. And you can do that with a mask. I don't generally use them. I just tend to sort of play with the saturation on the whole image. But if you've seen the Spielberg movie, Schindler's List, there are some sequences in there which are black and white, but there's a little girl in there in a kind of red, pink coat, and that's very deliberately done so that it's almost, and it's a low saturation, the way the colour's been handled, but your eye's immediately drawn to her, even though you may not consciously register that she's in colour and everything else is black and white. So there are subtle things you can play with. Now, you might have ideas of your own on that. This might be an area that you want to experiment with. I've done this with portraits of people. There was a lady I shot on one location. It was very black and white, but she had this kind of red band around her waist. I don't know, clothing thing. But I played with the saturation on those and the contrast so that it kind of looked like a black and white picture, but there was that very dull pink in there from this band around her waist. So it was just something I wanted to play with, and I've done that with skin tones as well. So, there's a whole area of experimentation and things to discover once you start looking at colour, black and white, or some combination of the two. So, again, that might be something that you've seen in somebody else's work. It might be something that you like to play with yourself and experiment with. It might be something that once you're away from the action and you've got time to experiment, this might be something you want to do with your own images. Okay, so that pretty much covers, I think, the main things that I wanted to cover in this podcast. So again, it's another one of these, it's kind of a how-to, I think, but this, and it really applies to any kind of photography, to be honest. It's not just wildlife, but wildlife is what I primarily look at. It could also apply to travel photography if you're going somewhere different. Again, how do you want to frame your subject? What is the subject? Why are you taking the photograph? What do you want the viewer to get from it? How are you going to use colour? How can you make it artistic if that's what you want to do? Are you documenting what's going on? Do you want no artistic interpretation in there at all? So again, lots of different ways of approaching your photography. But whatever you're using this for, I hope it's given you some ideas and maybe a little spark of inspiration somewhere. Maybe a light bulb has clicked on. I hope so. And whether it has or not, I will speak to you in the next podcast. So bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.